Okay, so I think we'll get started here. Just for sequencing, we're gonna start with our PJM folks visiting all the way from Valley Forge. And PJM, I'm sorry, what did I say?
PJM.
Yeah, PJM.
That means something.
Yes, so well, they're gonna explain all that. That's why they're here, the PJM interconnection grid. And the Public Service Commission, Obi, you'll go next, okay, after we're done with our PJM interconnection, and we will explain what PJM is, et cetera, for the benefit of everybody. So with that, visiting from all the way from Valley Forge is Asim Hack and Stu Whittem from the PJM interconnection. And I know you all have a PowerPoint, and we've been eager to have you all down here along with our Public Service Commission to just educate the committee on high-level energy policy, the basics, and, you know, before we get some heavy-duty energy bills in here in the committee. So do you have a preference on who starts and who's going to run the show on the PowerPoint?
Chair Feldman, I'm actually going to be presenting on behalf of PJM. I'm here with my colleague Stu Whittem. So Stu Whittem is PJM's representative to the state of Maryland. And if you've got some very Maryland-specific questions, we will hear from Stu as well, but hopefully Stu will become a friend of yours as you are developing out your committee agenda, policy, et cetera. But it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Vice Chair Kagan. We're very happy to be here. This slide deck is extensive, so I would think about this more as reference material, and we will try and push through it as rapidly as we can, because I know we've got a lot of ground to cover in this deck. I know that the PSC is up after us, so we will push through this relatively
And before
quickly.
you get started, because Vice Chair Kagan really wanted to know what PJM stands for exactly.
Sure.
Why don't you start with that so we can get that off the
Well,
table?
Vice Chair, PJM began as a power pool, and the three originating states were Pennsylvania, Jersey, and Maryland. So Maryland plays a very important role historically and currently at PJM interconnection. So great question. We are the grid planner and operator for 13 states and the District of Columbia, including the entirety of the state of Maryland. Let's go to our first substantive slide, please. So I've been asked to start here, the basics of power delivery. Power delivery generally consists of three components: generation, so the actual creation of a watt; transmission, that's the transmission of that watt from generator to distribution substation; and then distribution. That's the third component: generation, transmission, and distribution. Distribution is effectively that function that takes power from a substation into your homes and businesses in the state of Maryland, and that is regulated by the Maryland PSC. We operate at the bulk level, and the bulk level is generally thought of as generation of the watt and high voltage transmission of the watt. Next slide, please. And the necessity of an entity like us is because the bulk power system, the grid, is a machine. And in fact, in the United States, it's three really big machines. You've got the Eastern Interconnection, and that's highlighted there in light blue. You've got the Western Interconnection, which is effectively to the west of the Eastern Interconnection, and you have Texas. So you have three what we call interconnects, three large machines that comprise the bulk power system in all of North America. Electrons don't know state boundaries, and the bulk transmission system is interstate in nature. And so we plan and operate the bulk power system for part of the Eastern Connection, which is shaded there in the dark blue. Again, 13 states and the District of Columbia. Let's go to our next slide. Our primary focus at PJM is reliability, the preservation of system reliability. Our society, our regional and local economies have come to expect and rely upon all of us in the industry maintaining a reliable system. And so each and every day, that is what we strive to do. And we support that primary focus through these components. You see markets, operations, and planning. And we'll deep dive those a little bit. Let's go to the next slide. This is sort of a different look of our three core business functions. So think of planning as urban planning, just with high voltage transmission lines. Think of operations as effectively the air traffic controller of watts of electrons. And then think of markets as, hey, here's the demand for power, who wants to supply it, and let's try and get that cost down. Let's utilize our regionality, let's utilize our scale to run a marketplace to bring costs down for consumers. Now, next slide, please, Stu. As we mentioned, PJM has been around a long time. There are a number of little data points here on this slide. Again, the M stands for Maryland, was formed in 1927 as a power pool and has evolved over time with various milestones. You will see here that a body named FERC is referenced. That is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission based out of Washington, D.C., and they are our regulator. Next slide. But we are different from your typical utility company based upon the function that we serve and our setup. And here are just some basic ways that we are different. One of the more important differences I'll point out is that we are effectively a nonprofit. Our rates are predetermined by the FERC. Our budget is predetermined, and at the end of the year, if we come in under budget, we refund that money back. We don't have shareholders. We don't have quarterly earnings. We are effectively a nonprofit that is mission-driven. We also don't actually own any of the bulk power assets that I referenced. We don't own any of the generators. We don't own any of the transmission lines. So in everything that we do, we partner with these entities who are, quote, our members, in order to ensure system reliability. Let's go to the next slide, Stu. So our primary focus is reliability, and through the use of, again, this regionality, this scale, we are able to save consumers money, $3.2 billion to $4 billion annually. Also, this regional scale will become more and more important as states pursue their energy policies, whether that's leaning on a neighbor conceivably to help preserve reliability or to utilize scale to drive down energy costs or costs of clean programs. And these clean energy policies are a priority for PJM. We want to utilize our regionality, our scale, our subject matter expertise to help states like Maryland both think through and advance their state policy goals. These are the strategic pillars of PJM's 5-year strategy that we promulgated just a couple years ago. Reliability underpins all things. Reliability is our primary focus, primary mission, underpins all things. And one of those strategic pillars, as you'll see, is to try and facilitate state and federal decarbonization policies. We are not a policy maker. I want to make that very, very clear. We intake policies and then try and make them work within the PJM construct of planning, markets, and operations. So one of our strategic objectives is to help states facilitate, state and federal government actually, facilitate decarbonization policies cost effectively and reliably. We also have two other pillars, trying to plan for the grid of the future and innovation. The grid is evolving, changing, new technology, new types of generating resources. So we have to be very thoughtful about how we plan that grid of the future. And like any organization that exists in sort of the technology space, as we in part do, we want to make sure that we are innovating all along the way. We have an arm, next slide please, Stu. We have an arm that is purely dedicated to this mission of assisting states advance their policies. It's a unit that is found under my umbrella at the company. It's called State Policy Solutions. Its entire objective is to help states advance their policy initiatives. Let's go to the next slide. Now, PJM fully realizes that we are in the midst of an energy transition. When you look at our generation interconnection queue, okay, and that's basically the line that generators get into to hook into the grid, over 95% of that queue, that line, is some combination of solar, wind, or hybrid resource. So this is a reality for us, and it's not theoretical. We are at the early stages of an energy transition. And so we are studying the transition and grid impacts from a physics and engineering perspective, and we have advanced a series of what we're calling energy transition studies. And we'll continue to advance these analyses to help plan for and navigate this transition. Next slide, Stu. And in the 1.0 version of this energy transition study, there's actually been a 2.0 and a 3.0 will come out later this year. These were the conclusions. And I think one item that's important to note for this committee, generators, those units that generate power, they are not all the same. Their physical properties and interactions with the grid are all different. So the physical properties of renewable generators versus gas generators versus nuclear generators are all different. Nuclear runs effectively 24/7. Renewables don't, although clearly renewables are our cleanest form of generation. Gas generation provides great system flexibility. The units just are not all the same. Thermal generators. We take a look at the third finding here. Thermal generators, in particular, support important grid physics, like the concept of inertia, short circuit strength, dispatchability. So that third finding on the slide is relevant, something that I'd ask you to keep in mind as you're crafting policy. Surely, we are headed towards a greener future. PJM embraces that, as you saw in our 5-year strategy. But we have to be careful not to jeopardize reliability for your consumers and businesses in the process. Now, we have worked with states on this. We have worked with states that want to advance clean policy initiatives. We've worked with them on reliability safety valves to those policies and reliability guidance related to their policies. We did it in Illinois last year with their Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, and most recently in New Jersey with their carbon emission limitation regulations. So PJM had one ask of this committee. It's to understand that the grid has a significant amount of science and engineering and physics that support it, and that we would like to work with you, if at all possible, to ensure that as you transition, just as we have with Illinois and New Jersey, as you transition, that you're able to keep the lights on. And I think we can do both. Let's go to the next slide. I want to spend a few minutes just focusing on state RPS targets. We've got quite a few of these policies in the footprint. Most are centered around wind and solar. We have some offshore wind goals as well that are highlighted. And we have some pretty unique state RPS standards out there. We have one state awards RPS to swine waste. We have poultry litter. We have coal mine methane, actually, in our footprint. Regardless, we want to help facilitate these state goals. Next slide, please. I was asked to talk a little bit about, how we do this. So every state has this RPS, so how then does PJM interact with that RPS? And through an entity called PJM EIS, we have a system called the Generation Attribute Tracking System, or GATS. Every megawatt hour of energy that is produced by one of these RPS facilities is effectively tagged and tracked. Let's go to the next slide real quick, Stu. And what is provided to that megawatt hour of power is a renewable energy certificate. Represents an environmental or other non-power data attribute created when that megawatt hour is generated. So power is generated, it's tagged, it's tracked through this renewable energy certificate function. Let's go to the next slide, Stu. And then this is just a visual diagram of what we do. Those RECs can then be acquired, traded, then effectively cashed in, not for cash purposes, but cashed in to meet compliance with state policy objectives. So it is a service that we provide that I think is just generally a value add and helpful to states and businesses who have sustainability objectives as well. They may have their own sort of, we want to get to net zero by a particular date and would like to have a service to help them track that. PJM is able to do that. Let's go to the next slide, Stu. Okay, just a one-layer dive into each of the three core business functions at PJM. We can spend hours in any one of these subjects. We promise you we won't do that today, but maybe just 30 seconds to a minute on each one of these functions. And the first we'll spend time on is system operations. These are reference slides, effectively, and we're going to push through them very, very quickly. This is the PJM backbone system. This is the 345 kV, the 500 kV, and the 765 kV transmission system across the PJM footprint. Next slide. And this is just a zoom in on the Maryland, DC area, just so you know where your major transmission assets are physically located. Now, there are what we call local projects, and those are transmission projects that are built out by transmission owners in the state of Maryland that are smaller in voltage, that help to also preserve reliability for consumers in the state of Maryland. Those are not indicated on the quote backbone, but you should be aware that there's backbone transmission, there's also local transmission as well that your transmission owners in the state build out. This is PJM's control room. I know some of you have been up to Valley Forge to see PJM's control room. We welcome all of you. Anytime you would like to come and visit, Senator Brooks has been there. I know Senator Feldman has as well, perhaps others. And so anytime you would like to come see the PJM control room, we welcome you. This is where effectively our operators, highly trained operators, have to obtain various training and certification on an annual basis, actually operate the entire PJM system, ensuring that power gets delivered effectively in real time from point A to point B. Let's go to the next slide. We were asked to talk about this as well. Maryland is generally a net importer of power. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, as we have a number of states in the footprint that are net importers. Some are net exporters. We have an application actually on pjm.com that actually shows PJM state imports and exports at any given time. Let's go to the next slide. PJM markets. Okay. This one also could be not only a multi-hour but a multi-day presentation, but we'll do just a very quick one slide. I think it would be the takeaway on markets is that we've got markets that are long-term in nature and markets that are short-term in nature. And the two primary markets that I think you'll hear about in this committee setting are what's called the capacity market and the energy market. The capacity market is a 3-year forward-looking market that effectively procures power to be there 3 years into the future. It's to make sure we have enough resources 3 years into the future to meet projected demand. Okay, those units that clear the capacity market 3 years into the future, they receive a payment for simply being there. It ensures that we have enough resources to meet demand. Energy is actual production of power to meet demand. We have day-ahead energy markets, real-time energy markets. That's what actually, it's the watts that are actually produced to meet demand. So we have the sort of, maybe a way to think about it is we've got the reservation market, and we've got the actual, here's what's being produced and consumed market. Markets, actually. More, there's, like I said, a lot more to dive into with respect to markets, but we'll stop there for now as just sort of baseline education. Happy to dive into this more at a future date. Next slide, Stu. Let's talk about planning, last core business function. Another acronym that you'll hear about, the RTEP. It is the Regional Transmission Expansion Plan. It is effectively how we plan the transmission system. Various drivers find their way into the RTEP. Reliability, market efficiency, public policy, and that's becoming more and more of an interesting debate within the halls of PJM and its stakeholder processes, as well as in DC. How do we incorporate public policy into the transmission planning process? Really robust discussions happening in both of those venues, and really robust discussions that will happen, across our states as we continue to evolve our transmission planning. Let's go to the next slide, Stu. And This is just a diagram to show how public policy can find its way into the RTEP. I want to touch on one of these approaches specifically. Let's go to the next slide, Stu. Something called the state agreement approach. And so you might hear this acronym, the SAA, or the state agreement approach, but PJM's transmission planning, historically, we have built transmission to meet reliability needs. We've built transmission to meet market efficiency needs, okay? But public policy is something that we are admittedly still trying to figure out how to construct transmission and allocate those costs appropriately. Well, the state of New Jersey actually decided to utilize a lever that's been available to states for a number of years through a FERC order, Order 1000, won't get deep into that. And effectively what New Jersey said is, look, we know that the FERC has approved this method. And in this method, we can build the transmission system to help our policy goals, and our ratepayers will pay for the build-out. Okay, that is effectively what New Jersey has done with their offshore wind objectives, and it's something that you might hear about as you're progressing through policy discussions related to your policies and how to build transmission in order to meet those policies. Let's go to the next slide. These are purely reference slides. We won't spend a lot of time here, but if you're interested in PJM's annual fuel mix, this shows 05 to 21. What you'll see is nuclear holds relatively steady. We've had a flip from coal to gas. Renewables are growing in share, although there's a lot more growth certainly to be done there. One thing to be aware of, and I don't know if there's a slide in the deck associated with this, is we have a really robust, again, generation interconnection queue. These are generators that want to find their way into the system. And it's, Stu, help me, 160,000 some megawatts right now?
Over 200,000.
Over 200,000 megawatts right now. And so there are quite a few renewable facilities in our queue, and so that's why when we talk about the energy transition, we certainly believe that, you know, we are preparing ourselves, and it is a reality for us. It is a reality that these are the resources that are going to find their way into the system. The PJM system mix, it's a balance of nuclear, gas, and some coal. Renewables, again, growing in share. Next slide, Stu. Maryland's existing installed capacity, again, another reference piece for you all to have. This is, again, capacity. This is not energy, right? So that is the next slide. So in 2021, what were the actual fuel types that were generating power to serve consumers in the state of Maryland? And that's what this slide and these percentages represent. Let's go to the next slide. We've actually had significant reduction in emissions since 2005. Much of this related to the coal to gas switch. So, you know, I've been in the space for a while, have seen sort of policy trajectories advance, seen economics advance, and there has been a natural reduction in emissions as a result of that coal to gas flip. Let's go to the next slide. Maryland situated, you know, similarly as the entire footprint, if not better, but a reduction certainly over the span of many years from 2005 to 2021. Okay, I've been asked to spend maybe just 2 minutes talking about security, and we'll talk about security. When we think about security, we really think about both cybersecurity and physical security, both. Now, we have our internal practices that we utilize. We follow NIST, NIST guidelines. Oh, your district, excellent. Very good, very good. Follow NIST guidelines associated with security protection, and we actually are obligated to follow standards that are created by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. Another acronym you might hear is NERC. NERC is an entity that reports into the FERC that is responsible for reliability across the, many acronyms, across the bulk power system, and they promulgate cyber standards, physical standards, that we are obligated to follow along with the internal framework that we utilize. We're also extremely proactive about the concept of resilience. And, resilience is for the ability for PJM and the electricity system to recover quickly in the event of a cyber or physical attack. Let's go to the next slide. This is just a framework that we utilize to manage security threats. PJM's cybersecurity program, and physical security as well. This is, for us, again, a high strategic priority. Want to identify potential threats, and then we go through this framework of protect, detect, respond, recover, and then after we've recovered, obviously measure, educate, partner, feed all of that into the identification process. This is a framework that we utilize with relative consistency. Okay. My last set of slides relate to the recent winter storm that we had. I did not plan on going through these slides in full. I'm happy to take questions about what happened with Winter Storm Elliott, but effectively, you had extreme temperatures. In fact, we experienced the largest temperature drop, I believe, in the history of the RTO, and it's in the slides here, 29 degrees. Over a 12-hour period, it was the largest drop in temperature that we had seen at PJM. Let's go to the next slide. I'll just push through them very, very quickly. Demand, load, was extremely high during this period, a real outlier from what we have seen historically. This demand, this load actually stayed very high overnight, which is the next slide, which is also, if you look at trends, extremely unusual from what we have seen historically. This is effectively the story of Winter Storm Elliott. Let's push forward a number of slides too. Let's push forward to slide 43, which is one more. And effectively, the story coming out of Elliott is, first thing is, we have some work to do in our load forecasting model. That model is effectively an algorithm, and that algorithm utilizes historical data. If I showed you all those graphs where this particular event was sort of outside of the norm, what you'll find is that the algorithm under forecasted, and that's something that we have to fix eventually. Well, not eventually, here in the near term, but despite having a lower forecast, we actually scheduled, because our operators felt like, this doesn't seem right to us, so they had the ability to schedule more generation, scheduled more than enough generation to try and meet demand for that particular period. And we just had a significant number of generation outages. We are currently trying to unbury the why behind why so many generators failed to perform. And that information is currently being aggregated. And as we have more information, we will make sure to push it out. We expect a report to be issued on this event. More and more information will be released on this event. And also the FERC and the NERC, two acronyms that we learned today, are actually undertaking an investigation across the country because we weren't the only grid that was really challenged during Winter Storm Elliott. That is it as far as my presentation goes. We covered quite a bit of ground and happy to delve into anything you'd like to delve into or come back later for deeper briefings on any particular subjects.
Okay, well, let me just say, having been to your control room, and I know Senator Brooks has been there as well, if there is interest during the interim, take a little field trip, road trip, bus trip up to see the headquarters in the control room. Just, let me know. We can do that. I thought it was, and I think Senator Brooks, would you agree? I thought it was really, really, really interesting just to see the, the brain trust, if you will, at work. That said, we're going to lead off with Vice Chair Kagan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both for being with us today. I just want to, so you acknowledge that NIST is in my district. For anyone watching who doesn't know, that it's the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and it is the coolest federal agency that no one has ever heard of. So just want to give you a shout out to everybody who works at NIST. I wonder if we could go back to slides 32 and 33. I just had a quick question. I didn't want to interrupt the flow. The energy was good. Could you tell us why the uptick in both of those slides in 2021? We had a downward trajectory, and that was reversed. Could you explain that, please?
It's primarily due to the price of natural gas relative to the price of coal. For those particular periods of time, gas got very expensive for a period of time. And it could be the other specific factors associated with availability of generating facilities.
Pate, what do you anticipate if you are still pulling together data? How will 2022 go? Will we go back to decline or increase?
Well, again, some of that had to do with COVID recovery. And I think right now we're hopefully fully out of COVID. I suspect that it will be not elevated above those levels, but somehow clearly higher than what we've seen in 2020 when COVID was at its peak.
Thank you.
We are not immune from also world dynamics. Seeing the war in Ukraine has actually had a downstream impact on natural gas pricing, and so we are not immune from that. We have quite a bit of natural gas generation in the footprint, and so as Stu referenced, the price of natural gas was high in 21 and likely will be, I think the price of natural gas is high in 22 as well, but we don't have that data yet, but when we are able to update this, we'll provide it to you.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go to the Senate cybersecurity expert, Senator Hester, since you referenced cybersecurity attacks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had two questions, actually. The first one's about cybersecurity. So you mentioned that is everybody within the PJM required to meet the NIST standard?
I believe that is something I will, Senator, let me get back to you with certainty. I believe that we as a, there's this distinction between transmission owner and transmission provider, TOP, and I'm not sure if it is by obligation or by our own adoption that we utilize the NIST standards. So let me get back to you on that, a question in particular. Sorry, go ahead.
So if you're gonna look into it, I'm specifically interested in this different size of the participants, right? And the different utilities, like whether, only people above a certain number of, ratepayers.
Yeah, it's a great question.
And thank you. And then my second question was actually about the transmission. I was looking at the coastline and it looked like there was very little transmission on the eastern part of the state. Is that true?
Let's take a look. Stu's pulling it up. Slide 19. Yep.
So there is transmission on the eastern shore of Maryland and as well as in Delaware. However, the voltage of that transmission system is less than the ones prescribed here, dictated here. So it's mainly a 230 kilovolt system on the eastern shore of Maryland. You could see on the western shore and surrounding states, it's much higher. And it has to do with load pockets and where people live and the amount of consumption of electricity on specific areas. So there is a backbone on the eastern shore, but it's a lesser voltage backbone.
Red?
That's right, because red is the higher voltage ones. If we were to ask this chart to provide the lower voltage ones, you'd see all types of squiggly lines on the eastern shore in Delaware as well as in Maryland.
And Senator, it's just our characterization of what we deem to be, quote, backbone transmission. And so that Stu is right in the red there. That is, quote, what we would deem to be backbone transmission, but there are lower voltage transmission lines in that area.
Senator Brooks.
Thanks, Chair. Sam, thanks for an awesome presentation. You'd mentioned that reliability is your primary focus, and hence that would bring, I guess part of that would be the capacity market, and making sure that that energy is there when you need it. And I guess we could let the committee know that when you talk about that cost is factored in, even though, say, there might be a situation when nothing is being generated, but just having that reliability, having those particular people there to generate that if you must call upon them. Now, in a situation where they don't deliver, is there a tremendous penalty for that?
Yeah, Senator, thank you for that question. There is a penalty structure. It's supposed to be sort of a carrot and stick approach. So there is a penalty structure in place if generators don't perform when called upon. The generators effectively fund that penalty pool. Then for those that sort of take up the slack for them, sort of overperform, they get what are bonus payments effectively. So this is again, sort of carrot stick approach to trying to ensure that these generators are in fact performing, but also, let's just say that those generators don't, we want to also make sure to incent what is effectively overperformance. Now, so that is the framework that's in place, and certainly during this Winter Storm Elliott, with all of those generators that did not perform, we're in the process of trying to determine what that, who specifically, generator-wise, will have a penalty ascribed to it, who will have a bonus payment due to it, and the recovery of those monies from generators effectively.
All right. Second question, I think it was slide 20, panel 29, where you were showing the productivity of generation coming from the various sources. And I think, yeah, there, oops, go back one. That's the one.
PJM. There
PJM, yeah, I think nuclear
no-
was pretty consistent, and I think there was a reduction in the coal, and then the gas was going up.
Yep, I think maybe the bar graph,
The bar graph, yes.
yeah, that has, go back. Yep, that one.
There we go, that one.
Yep.
Yes, yeah. So is that a prediction of the future?
Yeah, I just think in looking at the trend line, you have seen more and more coal retire across the footprint.
Right.
You've seen gas effectively take, a share of the fuel mix. What we are seeing is quite a bit of activity on the state and federal policy front around curtailment of emissions. And so, one thing that we have actually provided rough data around this. We actually see quite a few due to policy considerations, which are consumer preference, arguably consumer preference considerations as well. We see quite a few of our gas generators also, from a policy perspective, going to be asked to retire as well. So I've mentioned Illinois' Climate and Equitable Jobs Act is a piece of legislation that requires that. We've got, again, in New Jersey, these carbon emission limitation regulations. And so what we will see is the share of natural gas decreasing. You're going to see an increased number of renewables. Nuclear holds relatively steady. We have lost over the span of time a unit or two, but nuclear holds relatively steady across the fleet from '05 to current day.
Okay. Okay, all right, one more, okay, yeah. SMRs, small modular reactors, yeah. There's been some buzz about that. Number one, because it's scalable, they feel as though the cost of just building, from ground up to specific, for a specific plant, there historically has been these tremendous cost overruns, but with the SMR, that means that, you can have GE build them, the life is about 30 years, and then in situations where you're trying to reduce or eliminate coal generation, you can bring a 2-pack, a 4-pack, a 6-pack there. The infrastructure is already there, so that would probably address some concerns. At least you don't have to start from ground zero because the infrastructure is there.
And before you go any further, because Senator Kagan will weigh in, SMR, small modular.
Modular, okay.
Oh, you said that? Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm sorry, small modular reactors. Okay.
Yeah, Senator, we are excited about and look forward to any innovation that can help maintain reliability on the system and, of course, keep costs as low as possible for consumers. And that's not a dodge, in all honesty. we don't sort of, in our world, while part of our strategy is to help facilitate state and federal policies, unequivocally, it's part of our strategy. In our sort of mission and what we're trying to do on a day-to-day basis, again, primarily, it's to try and preserve reliability and also keep costs low through markets for consumers. And so anything that can be added to that, to our regime, to help in either of those causes, we're very happy to intake, that new technology. We've got to create the right environment for that technology to be successful, from a grid planning perspective, from a markets perspective, because sort of, implicit in the testimony I provided today is, we understand we embrace where the policy trajectory is headed. At the same time, we've got this reliability issue. And our hope is that they're not on a collision course, okay? But any resource, whether it's these small modular nuclear reactors or whether it's hydrogen, that can find their way into the system, provide the same reliability attributes that some of our thermal resources are providing today, keep costs low for consumers, we'd love it. And we're trying to create the right environment to allow for those types of new pieces of technology to find their way into the system, and that's important for us.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Okay, we'll go to Senator Washington and then Senator Simon Nair after that.
For your presentation. Sorry, another obligation made me miss some of this, so I'm hoping this wasn't covered.
Sure, no, please.
I'm interested in the infrastructure, and particularly of the gas infrastructure, so, of natural gas. So you're saying we're going to decline its use. I just want to get that. You're predicting that the use of natural gas declines, but at the same time, in terms of current cost to consumers and efficiency and reliability of the system, where are we while we are transitioning? Where are we in the infrastructure, the quality of the infrastructure? What needs to be addressed?
Yeah, thanks, Senator. So let me try and address sort of the various facets of your question. So the first question around, are we likely going to see a decline in natural gas generation? I am not predicting anything, but if you just look at the sheer facts, the facts are there are policies that exist on the state and federal side to curb emissions and at a date certain in the future have these generators leave the fuel mix. So that is sort of fact. Also fact, we have very little natural gas in our generation interconnection queue. So, I've got to be careful not to be in the prediction game, but if you just look at those facts, then that leads to a particular conclusion. As far as natural gas infrastructure goes, PJM's sort of purview is we don't really have purview around infrastructure. What we try and do is to, outside of the actual generators themselves, what we try and do is through markets incent good functional reliability for that infrastructure. And so, we wouldn't, for instance, be out inspecting pipelines, or we wouldn't be inspecting wellheads. That would be under the purview of likely an environmental regulator, state regulator as well. But what we try to do is we try to get good performance out of gas generators through incentivization or the penalty structure through our marketplace. I hope that makes sense.
Helping me learn more about the division of labor, so to speak. Could you speak to the role that infrastructure would play in the area in which you do have?
Sure. I'll use Winter Storm Elliott as a great example. Okay, so we don't know the reason for all of the outages we experienced. A large share of the generators that were out were natural gas generators. that could very well be because of a lack of fuel, because of freeze at the wellhead or freeze within the pipeline system. And so when we think about infrastructure, that's really when infrastructure comes into play for us, is if the infrastructure is not sound, is not winterized, we could have issues with ensuring reliability. And so that's something that, I think collectively we have to tackle. That, how to ensure sort of winterized gas infrastructure and ensure enough supply gets to those generators to produce power is a really challenging nut to crack, because there are multiple sort of layers of purview, both federal and state, involved in that. And the gas industry is effectively in the PJM sphere sort of separate and apart from our interactions, other than we do have informal interactions with pipeline companies regarding their availability and their operations. So it's important. It's definitely important. But our role is to try and set up the right markets infrastructure. I shouldn't use the word infrastructure. The right markets dynamic, I would say, to try and incent good performance of that infrastructure.
Would you say then that infrastructure is part of the dynamic of setting up the markets that can provide reliable, affordable energy to consumers?
I think we want to try and incentivize that generators shore up their infrastructure so that they can provide reliable service to consumers.
Thank you.
Sure.
Senator Simoner.
Thank you, and thank the chairman for this briefing. Some of us have not sat up in finance and listened to all this. It kind of reminds me of going on a new program, and you have all the new acronyms, and everything's coming at you. So this was very helpful. I thought you did a great presentation. So we sat last couple of years in this committee talking about climate solutions, and one portion of that we kind of just sent up to finance was the electrification, getting away from gas. So wondering what kind of time frame the grid can handle that extra capacity that has to be built. And looking at your charts over the last 15 years, I see the renewables, if I'm reading it correctly, are relatively small and don't increase much. What is going to get us to the point where the renewables are going to take up a big portion of that, and can they reliably provide what we're asking of you? I know
Yeah.
that's kind of a big question.
Sure, yeah. On the electrification front, I don't have, only sort of want to speak from science, right? But I don't have a study or an analysis to show you to say, here's how much we can electrify and here's how much we can't. Just macro perspective. When you electrify, it will increase demand on the system. We are in a position right now where, because of primarily policy drivers and some economic drivers, we are going to see more resources, generating resources, leave the system. So just think about those two just macro effects. Further, deeper electrification, more demand, and then more generation leaving the system. But we do have quite a bit of generation in our queue that is trying to find its way onto the system as well. So there's uncertainty, I would say, that we are all collectively as a community trying to manage with something like deep electrification, okay? As far as your question regarding renewables, I think naturally renewables are going to start taking up a larger share of the power mix. Again, you have policy and economics driving combination of coal and gas out of the fuel mix. In our queue, tons of renewable facilities. It will naturally occur. What we are trying to do in the market space, first of all, interconnection. So you might have heard this concept of, I've talked about the interconnection queue. That has been generally pretty plugged up over the last few years. We promulgated a proposal, received approval from the FERC to kind of unclog our generation interconnection queue to better streamline these resources finding their way into the system. So if you talk to, I'm sure there's a bunch of stakeholders in the room. If you talk to stakeholders, they'll say, well, interconnection's a mess, and we're trying to cure it, and we've got an approval from the FERC to cure it. Now, so again, I'm getting to your question of, so we talked about electrification, I'm getting to your question of when will we see more renewables on the system? As we continue to unclog this interconnection queue, you're gonna see more renewables on the system. The only thing we gotta be cautious about though, and this is why we work with states to include reliability safety mechanisms in policies, is that as more renewables enter the system, because these renewables don't have the same sort of thermal properties, reliability attributes as combination of nukes, gas, and coal. And it's the physics, and it's the physics of the system. We just have to make sure that as this will naturally occurring renewables find their way into the system, that we are keeping enough of those resources around in order to maintain reliability. That has to be done through scientific analysis. It is something that we will do within the state of Illinois. It is something that we will do within the state of New Jersey. And as you all are promulgating your policies, again, something that I would consider in order to make sure that we keep the lights on during the transition. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yes, that was. Two things. One is the electrification of vehicles is going to put more capacity
Sure.
requirements into that as well. And so just kind of looking at it, is that going to make much more renewables and nuclear? Is that going to, that's my first question. Is that going to be probably the mix going in the future? And then the other last question I have is, each state has its own policies based on what the legislature and so forth believe. But you're a regional organization. How does that impact, like, we're a net importer, so we're asking for other states to import electricity here. How do our policies, or the inverse, affect you, and how do you handle that at a regional level?
Yeah, great questions. So first on electric vehicles. Electric vehicles, something to consider there, and we are taking electric vehicle growth into account in our load forecasting. Something to think about there is that you've got sort of on and off peak charging. Peak takes place effectively in PJM in the mornings, and then in the sort of, we'll call it late afternoon, early evenings. It's all sort of residential load, families, et cetera. The ability to charge sort of off-peak may alleviate some of these concerns that we might have around having enough generation on the system. So that's one dynamic that we think about when we think about electric vehicles. On the every state's got their own policies. Certainly, one of the more challenging parts of our job is sort of the lack of homogeneity amongst the 14 jurisdictions. Now, I think where we find ourselves, though, is in a space where we want to utilize our regionality, we want to utilize our ability to have these big markets to help advance those policies. Okay, and that will provide value to consumers. It will provide value to your consumers at the end of the day if you're able to utilize that scale instead of, potentially have to sort of isolate and advance your policies. So I think that there is the ability to utilize PJM at large for the advancement of policies that will provide benefits to consumers. But I would say that there certainly is a difference of opinion on something like climate, something like what resources do we want to have in the system, considerations around competitive markets. This has been a sort of a historic debate at PJM. If you decide to provide an out-of-market payment to a resource in order to push it along, is that anti-competitive markets? And we've had very robust debates around this for a long, long time. And so, at the end of the day, Senator, we are trying to create an environment where policies writ large can succeed, okay? Where we have to be sort of honest with each other is around this concept of reliability and just making sure, because the harms of being unable to maintain a reliable system to local economies, regional economies, to public health, those are very concerning circumstances. At the same time, you could make a very similar argument on climate as well. We exist in sort of a very kind of trying to balance all of these things as we advance the system going forward.
And just to Senator Simon Ayers' point, just because I don't think you mentioned the 13 states plus the District of Columbia, which are part of PJM, it includes places like West Virginia, Ohio, Tennessee. Some of those states, like Virginia, have more regulated markets. So this is no small task to sort of accommodate the public policy interests of West Virginia, whose views on some of these issues are going to be, quite different than Maryland or some of the Northeast states. So I think that's actually a good question to pose, and it's a challenge, I think, for PJM to accommodate those different policy choices. But that said, any questions for our two PJM witnesses? Senator Hester?
If I could ask just one
Sure.
quick question. Since you're going back to check on the cybersecurity standards, could you also check on how they're monitored? Like, if everybody's supposed to be meeting a set standard, are they reporting to PJM? Are they self-certifying? Like, how do we know that the standards are being met?
Absolutely,
Thank you so much.
not a problem. Thank you.
Okay, any additional questions? Yeah, we have, we've got his the contact info, and then the PowerPoint, we're going to share that with the committee, so everybody will have a copy of this as well. Okay, thank you, guys.
Thank you.
And I'll keep you posted about potentially our road trip to Valley Forge as a committee to check out the control room, okay?
We'd love to have you. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, next up, we've got our Public Service Commission panel, and we've got Obie Litton, Commissioner Litton, as well as Lisa Smith, the Government Relations Contact Person for the Public Service Commission. So Commissioner Litton, you come up here once there's some space, and you can explain to the committee what the role of the Public Service Commission and what plays in all of this that we just heard from PJM. Okay, so Commissioner Litton, why don't you lead off?
Thanks, Senator Kagan.
We're just queuing up the PowerPoint. Okay, I think we're ready to roll. So Commissioner Litton, I'll let you lead off.
Thank you, Chair Feldman. Good afternoon to the members of the new EEE Committee. It's a pleasure to be here in front of you today representing the Public Service Commission. As Chair Feldman noted already, I'm here today with Lisa Smith, our Legislative Affairs Director at the Commission. On the slide deck to my far right is Kathy Fuston, who is assisting with our legislative matters and also as an executive assistant at the Commission. I'd like to take a little time here this afternoon, to talk with you a little bit about the Public Service Commission, at somewhat of a high level, but also just to give you a little understanding about what these important civic members of state government do on behalf of the citizens of our state. So on our first slide here today, we have 5
Hey,
smiling
Commissioner,
faces.
I did want to, I should have mentioned that Chair Stanek wanted to be here, but he's stuck in Dallas, Texas, so he just wanted to pass that on, otherwise he would have been here, so back to you.
Thank you. Yes.
Thanks for pinch hitting, yes.
Yes, sure. I'm pinching in now. He reached out to me yesterday afternoon. He's stuck in ERCOT down in Texas. There's a lot of ice and snow in Dallas, so we actually have nicer weather here. So he did send his regards, and he certainly wished that he could be here today to present to you. So a lot of the information that you already received from PJM's presentation a few moments ago can actually give you a little bit of context for some of the slides that are to follow this first one. The commissioners are all here at the Public Service Commission. You have the 5 listed in front of you. Of course, Commissioner O'Donnell needs no introduction to this legislative body as a former member for over 22 years. Commissioner Richard is also, he's from Baltimore City. He also has represented the state government both in the State House as well as working on behalf of the Maryland Energy Administration. Commissioner Bubar from Montgomery County has spent many years not only in the federal government but also working in environmental matters in Montgomery County. And of course, you know our chairman, he's been here before on many occasions. As for myself, I'm from Baltimore County. I've worked at the Public Service Commission since 2008. I started in the energy industry as an intern at the Public Service Commission here, but before that I was a meter reader in New Jersey. So I've been around the industry now for about 25 years, and I've got enough here now to show it. That is still my picture, but that was from several years back. So if we could move on. So the information you received from PJM is useful for this first bullet. The Public Service Commission was created in 1910, so we're about 115 years now, 14 years. But what's interesting to note is that prior to the commission existing, the General Assembly used to do the work of the agency. So rate cases, establishing the location of power generating systems, transmission lines at the time, all of that work was conducted by the General Assembly until the General Assembly recognized that the work was better spun off to a state agency, and so the commission was established. We are, by law, an independent agency. It is something that exists in all 50 states. Different states have different numbers of commissioners. Most tend to have 5, but there are a few states, such as Delaware, for example, with 3 commissioners, and there are some states, actually only about 1 or 2, that have up to 7. The responsibilities of the different agencies across the country can differ a little bit. I'll talk a little bit in the next slide about some of the matters that the Public Service Commission in Maryland regulates. But generally, it's to regulate the activities of our public service companies to ensure safe, economical, and reliable service. And I think it's important to note that it's something that many citizens of our state and across the country, we oftentimes take it very much so for granted. And that tends to be, at least from my perspective, as someone who's been in the industry for many years, I take that as a point of pride, that in working with our utility companies, with our elected officials, and various advocacy organizations, consumers don't think much about the reliability and the safety of service until, of course, it's not really there. I mean, today, right now, the energy that we're using to heat this building and place lights in this building is flowing through pipelines that have been managed for safety and regulated by our state government and in partnership with the federal government, power lines that stretch from here all the way out to substations and generation stations all across the region. And so it's a very large, complex network that's run by a number of very committed professionals. and it's good to know that it's running in a safe way. Some may think it's not always economical, but we can talk about that later if you'd like to do so. But we make sure that it's certainly safe and it's available for everybody to use. As you heard from PJM, we are a state-based agency, so we regulate intrastate utility services and not interstate services. So some of those would include the generation of energy and the transmission of energy through transmission lines. The transmission line across states is managed and regulated by the federal government, that will be FERC. And as for generation, some of you may know, the state of Maryland, along with 26 other states, deregulated the generation portion of the utility system back in 1999. And so our utility companies no longer own generation. They acquire it through wholesale markets, which PJM described during their presentation. So in terms of the work that the Maryland Public Service Commission does, in terms of the areas that we regulate, you have a list in front of you in bullet points. I won't read them all. I think it's interesting to note that some of these are areas that people may not have thought we regulated. For example, railroad companies, taxi cab companies. Although we don't regulate all of them across the state, it's primarily the ones in Baltimore City and Howard County. And of course, we also have, there's a few items that are missing here. We also have some regulatory authority over Uber and Lyft in terms of safety, making sure that the security background checks are conducted for their employees before they're able to move forward with serving customers. We also, I should point out that for purposes of water, we regulate private companies. These are not public companies. So, for example, WSSC in the Montgomery, Prince George's County region is not regulated by the Public Service Commission. They actually have their own set of commissioners who are appointed in conjunction with the local governments in both of those counties. We do not regulate the Department of Public Works in Baltimore City, which also serves Baltimore County. They are a municipal utility company, so they are managed by the Baltimore City government. We also do not regulate cellular service, cable service, internet providers, and as the last bullet does note out, municipal water and water sewage companies. I would also note that the Commission, we do not regulate we do not have a requirement under statute to provide a regulatory service for any type of supplier diversity initiatives. However, the Commission has engaged now for 29 years in what is considered a national program in terms of its respect from other jurisdictions. We have a memorandum of understanding with 17 regulated utilities in Maryland to encourage them through voluntary efforts to spend upwards of 25% of their annual spend with small minority, woman-owned, disabled, veteran-owned, and LGBTQ-owned companies in the state. Last year, for our last year in which we have data currently available, which is 2021, the program spent $1.4 billion with small and diverse-owned firms. I think it's important to note that here today that because the program was initially started, as I noted, 29 years ago, and two of the people who were very instrumental to that were Delegate Howard P. Rawlings and Delegate Elijah Cummings, both of whom, of course, have since passed on, but this is a legacy initiative that they worked on to initiate many years ago, and it's been quite an honor for myself to work on it here at the Commission during my time at the agency. As we noted earlier, the Commission has 5 appointed commissioners. Typically, it's done on a rotating basis, so there's a new commissioner every year. That can vary depending upon commissioners resigning or moving on for some other reason. We have an administrative division, which consists of our executive secretary, general counsel, which includes not just a general counsel, but a supportive staff. We also have our own IT division, which is somewhat unique among state agencies. We have a communications director, a very ably capable person, and a fiscal department, which handles a number of not only the fees and requirements for paying fees that individual companies might have in engaging in the state of Maryland. Our fiscal department handles all of that. We also have administrative law judges. In our agency, we refer to them as public utility law judges. They handle administrative cases as they are assigned to them by the commission or delegated to them by the commission. Technical staff, which has a number of, that's the largest department in the agency. It's roughly about 75 to 80 employees, consisting of accountants, engineers, economists, attorneys. We have some individuals who actually have two of those degrees, and maybe an accountant and an engineer. Don't have too many economists and attorneys, though. I don't think we have any of those. That's a unique mix right there. We also have a consumer affairs division. I didn't note this earlier, but I used to be the director of that division. I did that for 9 years at the commission before becoming appointed as a commissioner. They handle consumer disputes filed by customers from across the state of Maryland for any matters related to the utility companies and the services they provide, or any entities that we license, such as deregulated marketers and even taxi cab drivers. So by the numbers, as the title to the slide suggests, we have about 156 employees. That number has only increased a little over the last several years since I've been there. There have been times when state employees are oftentimes very attractive to private industry, and so as many other entities around the country are having challenges in recruiting and retaining employees, the commission does as well. They tend to get trained, and everybody would like to get them from us, and some of them are young, they get good opportunities, they move on. But we tend to have around 156. We certainly, I believe we could use more. There's a number of new challenges, some of which you've heard from PJM, some of which are initiatives that the General Assembly, through the passage of legislation, has proposed and over the years. And those are going to require new expertise on top of the responsibilities that the agency already has. So in the future, that's a number that I think is going to need to grow. By way of comparison, the state of Pennsylvania's commission is roughly 3 times the size of ours. The state of Virginia is a lot larger than ours. I'd say at least half, at least twice as large as ours. They have 3 commissioners, but they also regulate banking and insurance. So it's a much more complex agency. Our operating budget is roughly $24 million, 97% of which comes from assessments of public service companies. So to state that a different way, what that means is that the commission's managing operating budget does not come from taxes or from fees charged directly to consumers. It is charged to the utility companies, with an additional 3% coming from a federal pipeline safety program, because the commission, in conjunction with the federal government, provides the inspections for interstate pipelines that are here in Maryland. So because we do that, we get to bill the federal government for that work. So roughly 3% of that $24 million budget comes from that section. The transportation division, which I mentioned earlier, it is a bit unique in Maryland. There aren't a lot of commissions across the country that have this responsibility, but it is one of our larger divisions within the commission. Their work has been significantly increased as a result of the presence of the transportation network operating organizations such as Uber and Lyft. If you've taken an Uber or a Lyft, most likely I shouldn't say most likely, for certain, their background has been confirmed as being a person that they should be driving that vehicle. by the commission, in conjunction, of course, with the T&O companies. As you can see by numbers, I believe that was for 2022. We're monitoring 527,832 taxi and passenger for hire drivers, and I believe the majority of that will be Uber and Lyft drivers. The Consumer Affairs Division has received and provided assistance to over 1,800 customers over the course of the past year. What I would note for that particular number is that over the past year, the state of Maryland and the commission has had a series of protections related to COVID that will lift in April of this year. As we noted that federal government's protections are lifting in May as well. Those protections prohibited utility companies from denying service to consumers unless there were certain requirements met in advance. This is a series of protections that have been on the utility companies for the entirety of the COVID pandemic. And so I would suspect, as a person who's worked in that division and led that division, that we will see that number increase once the April timeframe lifts, only because the utility companies are now able to proceed with collection actions without following the more heightened protections that we had adopted during COVID. I would note that we have, in exchange for that, the utility companies will have to follow the existing Code of Maryland regulation protections that are in effect, and those are working fine. They will work fine. We have a number of people who are standing by and ready, and we've encouraged our consumer assistance network, which would loosely be referred to as the agencies that work on behalf of providing assistance to consumers, either financial or otherwise. We've heard from them that the network is not quite as strong as it used to be prior to COVID, but it is recovering, and we encourage our utility companies to work with them to make sure that when April comes around, our assistance network is ready to work with customers so that we don't see any challenges in providing assistance as consumers need it. So on the next slide, we have a chart that describes the Regulatory Research Associates rankings for Maryland. This is an organization that works with our different utility companies across the country to assess the investor risk that could be posed by state regulation. So as you can see, Maryland had a bit of a dip there between 2006 and 2009. I've been thinking a little bit about what was occurring during that period of time, and best I can recall, that was a period of time when the commission, through some transitional settlements that occurred as a result of the transition from deregulation from a regulated industry for generation to deregulated industry, one of our utility companies had a number of had a series of frozen rates that were lifted. Some might refer to it and recall it, at least those of you who are customers of BGE might recall it, the 72% rate hike. I see Senator Brooks is chuckling. He recalls that period of time. It was not a pleasant period of time to be in the agency, suffice to say, but it was for consumers who faced that period of time, they were not happy about it. There were a number of questions about how the state would move forward with regulation. And some of our utility companies were also facing some financial challenges. And so I suspect that was the reason for the dip. But I am pleased to say that since 2017, the numbers are moving in what I would consider to be the right direction. And let me just say, I'm thinking, because the presentation is pretty long, as we go through, if you've got questions, we'll do it contemporaneous. So once you finish your thought, and then I think Senator Hester's light was on, we'll just, as we go through the presentation, we'll take questions while we're going through it. So why don't you finish I think I interrupted you mid-sentence, so finish that, Senator Hester. My last part of the sentence was that I think the numbers are moving in the right direction. Senator Hester.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Commissioner Litton, thank you for pitch hitting today. Appreciate you being here. As Ms. Smith may have said, we've had a number of conversations with the PSC over the interim around cybersecurity. And, you know, you led off talking about how important the safety of the PSC is to the citizens of Maryland and to yourself. And so my question is, how can you assure us that the cybersecurity of the utilities that you manage is doing well? Like on the maturity framework of 1 to 5, are we at 2, are we at 3, are we at 4? And then as a follow-up to like your overall perspective on the cybersecurity, how do you monitor and track the implementation of the new regulations with respect to cybersecurity? Like, what is the process by which you check on how the utilities are doing?
Sure. So in response to your first question, and thank you for it, please, any other senator or member of the committee that would like to ask, as Chairman Feldman already mentioned, just jump in and we can resolve them. In response to your question, I would rank our status in terms of cybersecurity protection on a scale of 1 to 5. I would rank it at a 4.5. And the reason I will not say 5 is because the work of cybersecurity doesn't ever end. Each utility company has to constantly adapt and move forward to respond to whatever new challenges are out there that or new threats that are out there to their system. In terms of monitoring, the Commission is one of the few states in the country that's actually adopted some regulations requiring certain reporting requirements for our utility companies. It was a first step, and as part of our rulemaking adopting process, we acknowledge that up front. We know that there's more that, as a Commission, we need to do to make sure that our utility companies are following best practices across the country for purposes of cybersecurity. There's two other things that I could note here. First is that the Commission is very active in engaging with our utility companies on cybersecurity. We do have regular meetings with them as a full Commission. It's not just 1 or 2 of us, all 5 of us, as well as many of the experts that we have in the agency. The experts in the agency meet even more so with the utility companies. So the monitoring here is, and I think by necessity, not something that you would be able to find on record or in a paper record as you may for a rate change or a tariff change or something. And the reason for that is because of the importance of the utility company's work being somewhat secret and not available for bad actors to access. The utility companies are very concerned about the possibility of making a filing, for example, saying, here's all the things we do for cybersecurity, and someone getting access to that and saying to themselves, oh, wow, they're not doing this. And so that becomes a risk that has to be addressed. So we meet regularly with them. Our technical staff meets even more so to make sure that they are following the best practices that are available.
You have a follow-up? Yep.
I do, Mr. Chair, thank you. We were speaking over the interim. I mean, I can certainly understand not wanting to, lay out the problems that we're having with cybersecurity. But last year, we enacted major legislation that requires our agencies to certify that they're in compliance with minimum standards. Is that something that you would be open to?
That we'd be open to? I mean, I think that it's, for me personally, I would think we should be. I think that if nothing else, even if the general public is not aware of what specific acts the utilities are taking for protection of cybersecurity, they should at least know that the utility companies can say that they are meeting a minimum standard. And I think that the utility companies would want to be able to say that. They certainly have made that public before. And I think that if, as a general matter, we all know that cybersecurity challenges are there. And so we know that our utility companies, just from the meetings that not only that I've sat in, but the meetings that they've had with our expert staff, that they are working to make sure that the system is safe.
Senator Washington.
Thank you. Again, thank you, Commissioner Litton, so much for your service and for answering our questions today. So I have two questions, and one is follow-up similar to Senator Hester about legislation that was passed, our SB 31, that had to do with third-party energy suppliers. Specifically, the legislature's finding, and lots of others, that some, not all, that we wanted to maintain retail choice. So if we're going to keep retail choice, that there's quite a deal of evidence that there are some third-party suppliers that are deceiving residents and getting them into signing up for really expensive variable rate utility contracts. And this legislation specifically, since we're talking about taxpayer dollar and specifically a $15 million enhancement due to COVID for energy assistance, to not allow energy providers to sell at rates larger than the going rate. And so it would limit about, I think at the time it was about 70 third-party energy suppliers from doing this. So again, this is to protect our low-income households, save taxpayer dollar from inflated rates. Could you tell me where we are in implementing that?
Sure. So I guess there's two answers to that. One, we do have a slide on supplier, retail supplier and oversight and enforcement. But in direct response to your question, the Commission has been, at least in my experience, in my opinion, the Commission has been very aggressive in enforcing consumer rights and protections in the state. We've had a number of direct complaints against suppliers that have resulted in fines, many hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines. I think the number so far is up to 7 different suppliers. In fact, the new complaint was just listed yesterday for another supplier that is similarly operating the same way. In terms of the statute that was recently adopted last year, and I believe the one you're referring to is the one that prohibits suppliers from marketing to low-income customers.
No, it's not marketing. I mean,
or selling at all.
No, it's, and this is in your regulatory role, and we've not really received all the regulations on your implementation, but it was specifically to track accounts and make sure that accounts that are receiving OHAP dollars, right, are not signed up for third-party contracts that offer these variable rates that can enhance bills hundreds, if not thousands of dollars, and specifically because we're talking about state money, $15 million to help people pay their energy bills, and there are providers that are charging way in excess. So this was for the PSC to create a process by which these accounts could be flagged or monitored. And it's not last year, it's like 2 years now. So this was passed in '21. And they're not, so if the suppliers charge more, they're supposed to be kicked out, not being able to supply. So not going to penalize them if they do the right thing and abide by with the law. But we're receiving reports that only half of the accounts have been flagged or have been addressed, and that the PSC in your meetings are really pushing back on dropping accounts that are enrolled, with these energy suppliers prior to getting into OHAP. In other words, keeping them from getting into these dollars. So where are we going to go with this? And yeah.
Certainly. So thank you for the extra information. I appreciate it. I believe we are discussing the same piece of legislation. The Commission did adopt regulations to require any supplier first that if they were to sell energy to low-income customers, they first would have to be approved by the Commission to do so. And they would be required to provide that service at a rate that's below what we call the default rate or standard offer service rate. If they are not offering that rate and they haven't been approved by the Commission, then they cannot market or serve low-income customers. They would have to be on the utility standard offer service supply. With regard to tracking the customers, sure.
How many have you tracked or removed as a result? Or how many are in compliance? How many are out of compliance with the new regulation?
That I
Yeah, Senator, I'm sorry. I don't know off the top of our heads if we remember the effective date of those regulations, but we could certainly follow up and provide you.
If you could provide that to the committee,
Yeah.
because this is something that my office, other senators have been trying to get from the commission since the passage of that legislation, and the commission has not been cooperative. So I'm glad we're all here face-to-face now in real time. It would be, we'd really appreciate Mr. Chairman, getting that information.
Senator, I'd be happy to bring those regs by and confirm
could
the
share
effective
with the
date.
whole
They just
committee.
went into effect, so, and I think we had extensive rulemaking with a lot of the proponents that were here in Annapolis also involved. It was, I know it was arduous to come up with them, but they are done. Obviously, it has to go through the state process of promulgation and all that, but we can.
Because
if we
I chair AELR, I look forward to getting that so that we can, so I look forward to that.
Okay, great, perfect. We're happy to follow up offline if that's okay.
Yes.
We appreciate you staying on this and keeping us accountable.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr.
You know,
Chairman.
I remember the bill well because I believe I was the floor leader with you on the floor on that very bill, and I think I see Malcolm Augustine nodding his head. So yes, we definitely, having spent a lot of time on the floor on this issue, would like to see that. Okay, so why don't you go back, because you said there were even some slides on retail suppliers. So why don't we make some movement through the rest of your slide presentation?
Sure.
Obviously, as questions come up.
Sure, thank you, Chairman. So I did skip over the type of proceeding slide. It's fairly self-explanatory in terms of the types of proceedings the Commission has. We are what's referenced as a quasi-judicial agency. So our hearings can be of different types. When the slide deck references a trial-type proceeding, that is what you would typically refer to as an evidentiary proceeding. So there are motions that can be made by parties. There are requests to admit evidence as well as to take evidence out or to prohibit evidence from being entered into the record. The purpose for having those types of proceedings is because at times parties always have the right to appeal our decisions to the circuit courts and the judiciary. And the record that we create becomes the record that the judiciary looks at the first appeal, which would be in front of the circuit courts. We also have public comment proceedings, which we now have as a result of some of our system and operational changes during the COVID pandemic. We started using virtual processes for hearings, and that's worked very well. We have our Wednesday weekly administrative meetings. As we just discussed a few moments ago, we have rulemakings where the result moves to the ALR committee. We also have technical conferences where we invite different experts to come to the Commission and provide us with guidance or advice on different matters that might be pending in front of us. So with regard to supplier oversight and enforcement, we discussed a little bit. I think we all know what suppliers do and why this slide is very important. The Commission most recently noted an increase in consumer complaints from suppliers just last week, actually, as a result of a report that was developed, a quarterly report that was developed by our Consumer Affairs Division. It is public and it is online, so anyone can access it to see which suppliers are having an increase in complaints. And the Commission is committed to reviewing and being a bit more, what I would say, more aggressive in protecting consumers. So I want to be clear that we've been aggressive already. And so this is not a situation where where we weren't doing anything before and we're saying, oh, now we're really going to do something. It's more the case that we're taking a different approach to the types of, to the manner in which we would proceed with an investigation and the types of outcomes that we can look for. So the chairman made this announcement at our most recent hearing last week, our administrative hearing, and more information will be coming out, but we've already received some reaction from the deregulated marketers in the state. Several of them have reached out and have already sought our audience to learn more about what it is they're doing wrong and how they can do something better. And that's a good first start. But in the midst of all of that, what we don't want to see is that consumers are having a difficult time interacting with them. So the message that the commission has sent, and we've shared that message, and I think it's appropriate to say, and I believe the chairman said at our most recent administrative hearing that the Office of People's Counsel also supports the message and is working with us on this, is to make sure that the suppliers know that we're paying very close attention to the complaints that we're receiving from customers, and we're making sure that if we see trends going in the wrong direction, then the reaction will be swift. Our Consumer Affairs Division is the entity that produced the report that I mentioned earlier, and they're the ones that conduct consumer complaints into the practices of retail suppliers. Typically, we've only assessed monetary penalties and removed a supplier's right to operate in the state in the form of their license. I suspect that in time we do have other options that we can pursue, and I think that's the approach we'll be taking. To further explain the Consumer Affairs Division, it does have two units, both compliance and enforcement and dispute resolution. The Compliance and Enforcement Division is somewhat new. We've adopted some regulations about 7 years ago to give that unit some additional authority. And as a result of that authority, we now have several members of our staff who are reassigned to it from within the Consumer Affairs Division. They receive complaints, as I noted earlier, from public service companies, consumers who are having concerns about public service companies, as well as by any entities that we license. They can mediate disputes, but they can also seek a resolution that they can encourage the consumer and the utility or licensed entity to reach a resolution independent of the commission. So they can operate both as mediator and, if necessary, arbitrator in terms of recommending a resolution that the regulated or licensed entity may not be too happy with. And so we have some, I guess this is a chart, a couple of squares here, or rectangles that show the process that a complaint will move through. There's no need me reading all of those. They're there for you to reserve and see for yourself. I think the piece of importance is the last one. It's a good one to point out, that if for some reason the commission reaches a decision that a consumer is not pleased with, they do have additional rights. They can move forward to the circuit courts, and there's a statutory process that exists there where the commission will present itself, and the utility company tends to also be there, and a circuit court judge can review the decision that the commission has issued. So on slide 11, we talk a little bit about utility rate cases. This is really the primary responsibility over the years that the commission has had, which is to make sure that the utility companies are recovering the costs of providing service to customers, and that those costs are not, that they're not what we would call rate shock. You know, the consumers are not seeing increases that are not reflective of the services that the utilities are providing. So we have our technical staff that tends to provide and produce the expert analysis, and a number of interested parties participate in these rate cases, including the Office of People's Counsel, different corporations, and by corporations I mean both large corporations and smaller corporations, various advocacy organizations and community groups, and individual consumers tend not to participate. By statute, the Office of People's Counsel is the the entity that is required to represent the consumer interests in these cases. However, we do have public comment sessions so that individual consumers can provide their comments directly to the commission. Prior to COVID, we used to actually go to their service territories and take over a library or a small gym or something and invite all of the consumers in. They weren't always the most popular event for the evening. We tended to have sometimes a small audience, sometimes no audience. And on occasion, we'd have a few people there with really something valuable to add to the proceeding. And either way, and even if no one shows up, we do have a public comment docket that allows consumers to write us a letter, to write us, or to even send us an email to let us know that they have concerns or any thoughts they have about a rate case that's pending. And we are able to incorporate that into the case by reference.
Okay, we're going to go to Senator Washington had a question, Commissioner.
Oh, thank you, I do. Thank you for this section. I want to ask about a specific complaint, and it was a complaint by the Office of People's Counsel about false advertising, a false advertising complaint against Washington Gas. And as I understand it, Washington Gas included an insert in their bill that said, quote, "Natural gas is clean, efficient, and reliable energy. Converting all home to natural gas is the equivalent of planting 2.75 acres of trees or driving 26,520 fewer miles each year," unquote. So in 2021, the OPC filed a complaint and said that it was inconsistent with Maryland's climate legislation. The PSC ruled against this complaint, and the OPC appealed. And in the statement, and this is what's curious, and I want to ask you about it. In the statement on the appeal, the PSC, and this was dated October 3rd, 2022, you said, quote, "Is natural gas clean energy? Taken literally, the only clean energy is no energy." And this is on page 9. And then you went on to quote Paul Drisson, who is a known climate change skeptic. And the statement appeared to suggest that all energy sources have some drawbacks, so it's not worth distinguishing between them. So are you familiar with that? I know you didn't write it, but in thinking about your role, your regulatory role and how cases are handled, this is a curious, can you help me with it?
Sure, Senator, I'll take that one because I was working on that with the chairman and our general counsel when we received questions. We had a staff attorney, an individual line attorney, honestly, who filed that. That was not from the commission. It was not a commission order. It's the filing, unfortunate words, I agree. That's how it went out. The commission did not review it, unfortunately. As far as the outcome of the case, OPC lost the appeal in Montgomery Circuit Court. That's basically it. There's really nothing more to it, unless you want to add anything, Commissioner.
Just to follow up, so you're saying that this does not represent the view of the commission, but you also, more disturbingly, said that it wasn't reviewed. So it wasn't reviewed, so a statement written on a repeal by the agency that we've empowered to protect the consumers of the state of Maryland was not reviewed. That's what you just said. And it was never reviewed by the commission. Okay, okay, so that's what they said. Thank you. Very, very disturbing.
Okay, Commissioner Litton, why don't we, well, I would echo that point. I mean, we're talking about an appeal in a courtroom situation, an appellate brief or whatever, the reference to a line attorney and the chair or nobody else reviewed it is a little, seems unusual, but let's put that aside and proceed through the utility rate cases and what you've got left on the PowerPoint. And again, as questions come up, feel free to hit your button.
So I guess I did complete the utility rate cases slide. So I will move on to electric grid modernization. This was a proceeding that the commission initiated. We reference it internally as Public Conference 44. It was initiated, I guess, about 7 years ago, and it had a number of different objectives, which we've noted in the bullet points on the slide. These particular projects ended up resulting in different pilot initiatives that the commission is engaged in. The commission did adopt new regulations to streamline the process of interconnection for small renewable generator projects such as rooftop solar, things of that sort. We have the General Assembly adopted a statute or legislation that established and directed the commission to establish a storage pilot, which we're moving forward with now. The electric vehicle pilot continues to move forward. We have we're working towards just under 1,000 electric vehicle charging stations monitored and managed by our utility companies across their service territories, with the goal of obtaining data from them to learn more about how consumers are using for purposes of charging their electric vehicles, the time of day they're doing it, things of that sort. The electric vehicle pilot also includes some funding that was made available to encourage consumers to purchase charging at home, so that when they're using their home charging, we're able to monitor how often they're using the charger at home and what time of day they're using it, things of that sort, so that we'll have some understanding about when their charging impacts the load on the particular consumer's network and on the grid itself. As far as distribution system planning, we do have a working group that is working through a number of challenges there. It's a long and complicated matter. You heard a lot about it from PJM, and so I won't go into much detail with it here, but we're hoping to have some direction from that working group in the very near future. So I think you may have heard some of this information from PJM regarding Maryland's electric system. There are roughly 2.6 million electric customers in the state. There are more electric customers than gas or any of the other services that utility companies will provide. There are 5 investor-owned systems. I know the slide says 4, but the 5th one, well, that's electric utility, so that'd be 4. The 5th one would be Washington Gas, but that's not included as part of the electric slide deck. So we have 5 municipal systems and 4 electric cooperatives, including Choptank Electric Cooperative, whose our regulatory authority over was modified by the General Assembly. We also have a chart here which you heard a little bit about from PJM regarding the generation profile for the state. As you can see, nuclear is roughly 40% of Maryland's load, with natural gas being the second largest, and a number of renewable energy also incorporated here. So speaking of renewable energy, we have the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which was established in 2004. And the goals of it, which most of you should be you're probably familiar with, are established and listed here on the slide. The general goal was to create a market for renewable energy in Maryland. Although there have been many changes over the years, that goal is still there. And so the objective also was to lower the cost of obtaining electricity generated from renewable sources. And so the way that that's done is described a bit more on the next slide, which is through the creation of a renewable energy credit market that works in Maryland by statute. So in a nutshell, if a supplier in the state is, obviously wants to provide generation here. A portion of that retail electric sale has to be met with a renewable energy source. And actually, on the next slide, we list what those are. But if they're unable to do so because their generation is not one of the renewable energy sources, then they pay a penalty, which is the renewable energy credit that we then use to support the creation of new Tier 1 renewable energy sources in the state. So the tiers of the RPS program are listed on, this is slide 17, and we have, there's a number of them here, I won't list them all. Tier 1, different, I'm pausing here because I see ocean, and I'm not quite sure what just ocean by itself is, but there's a number of different types of Tier 1 renewable energy generating facilities that can be supported by the renewable RPS program. We do receive some RECs from states within PJM. That has been at times been an issue of some concern because we're supporting the development of renewable energy in other parts of PJM as opposed to here in Maryland. But the larger goal is to make sure that it benefits the region and it benefits Maryland by result. And so the program continues to do that. So we have, on slide 18, we have the RPS requirements for 2023 is 35.4% from Tier 1 renewable sources, including 9.5% from solar energy and just over 2% for offshore wind. And most of you know by 2030, we have 50% from Tier 1 renewable sources, including 14.5% from solar energy and 13% from wind energy, which included the recently approved by the Commission 1,200 megawatts of offshore wind projects.
I just wanted to mention that, of course, we were limited by the rate cap, which is also in the statute, and that would have to be increased to actually get to the 1,200.
Okay, go on. We're up to solar and
Yeah, that's not.
Commissioner Liu.
Okay. No, my slide is not. All right. So there's obviously two types of community solar solar that we use here in Maryland. There's rooftop solar, and there's also community solar. We've had there's been a lot of increase in rooftop solar over the last several years, and the Commission encourages that. And those are approved by the Commission when consumers wish to have that installed in their properties. The community solar is part of the pilot that was adopted with direction by the General Assembly a couple of years ago. This is okay. I'm sorry. The community solar program does do as it's described here, which is in situations where consumers are unable to install solar on their home property. They are able to purchase their community solar from a utility scale solar that's a project that's developed oftentimes by a third-party company. That particular project has some other requirements on it, such as providing certain benefits to low-income customers. Some of these projects have a small carve-out that is saved for low-income customers to benefit. Some of these projects are moving along very nicely. There are some that are having some challenges in moving forward because of some of the queue challenges that PJM mentioned earlier, but also because there have been some challenges working with local governments and some supply chain challenges in having the equipment necessary to move forward with the solar projects. hasn't been made available. People aren't able to, the companies aren't able to access it. So we would hope to have more community solar projects. We don't have as many as we'd like at this point, but I think there's more that are, hopefully, as the supply chain issues are alleviated and as the PJMQ matters are addressed, we should have a lot more available for consumers to participate in. We also have net energy metering, which is something that people with rooftop solar benefit from very greatly. In a nutshell, a consumer is able to sell the excess energy that they generate from their solar panels back to the utility company. Some consumers are able to sell quite a lot back, actually, to their local utility company, and it's above what they would normally use for themselves. So we have more and more consumers that are taking advantage of that. Some of you might even be using it as well. But we have more and more companies that are participating in that project.
Yeah, Senator Gallion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So there's a lot of new subject matter here, but I thank you for the presentation. So one quick thing before we get too far ahead. When you're talking about the energy that could be sold back, someone with we have solar and they have excess, they can sell it back. Is there a cap on that? And if so, what level is that cap on what could be sold back?
Right now, there isn't, to my knowledge, a cap. So if a consumer has, if they're generating enough energy to, I guess, effectively pay off the majority of their utility bill for the time when they're not generating energy, they can certainly sell all of that back to the utility.
Farm is producing like anaerobic digestion. There is a cap on that, though, correct?
I believe so, yes.
So why is there a cap on one and not the other?
Well, yes, it is statutory that at this point there isn't one, but from a policy perspective, the commission has never attempted to place a cap.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go to the two bills, offshore wind legislation. And we've got the Clean Energy Jobs Act. So,
Yes, thank you.
the Feldman bill is that second.
Sorry about that. I thought we were missing the slide, so my apologies.
That's all right. I was thrown off for a second earlier. That's because I knew that there was an offshore wind slide and I didn't see it, but here it is. So the commission has approved offshore wind projects under both the Maryland Offshore Wind Energy Act of 2013 and the more recent legislation from, I believe it was 2 years ago. In both instances, the second round of offshore wind added about 1,200 megawatts of offshore wind procurement. We have two companies that have won both of the bids, and both of them have been very active in moving forward with the projects. There's no turbines in the ocean off of Ocean City yet, but we do know that they're consistently moving forward. They are currently in front of the federal government's BOEM office, where they are attempting to receive approvals there. I would hope that we've actually been looking forward to the day when the offshore wind is established and ready to move forward. There are several other challenges with regard to the transmission necessary to bring the energy onshore, and so there's some issues there that needs to be addressed. And so there are a couple other layers that still needs to be worked on, but I believe that the commission has moved forward very well so far. So currently, moving on to the Empower Maryland program, the current Empower Maryland statute does dictate an energy savings goal of 2% of gross energy sales through 2023. The original goal of Empower Maryland was electric reduction program. So the utility companies developed different programs and initiatives that they presented to the commission for approval. And those initiatives were used in its total entirety to lower the overall consumption of electricity within the particular utility's service footprint. So you can see on the last bullet, the currently customers using about 1,000 kilowatt hours per month. The surcharges tend to range between $6.42 and $8, depending on the utility. The Empower Maryland surcharges are collected through a volumetric charge, which basically means that the more electricity you use, the larger the fee. So if you're able to take advantage of the different utility programs, or if there are other ways that you can conserve energy, the charge is less. Regarding the future of Empower, the Commission has had a stakeholder work group over the last 2 years working to develop a new framework and goals to find ways to convert the electrification reduction initiatives into more of a greenhouse gas reduction initiative. In the grand scheme of things, they are kind of similar in the sense that if you're using less electricity, then you're using less generation. And if you're using less generation, then that means we're using less natural gas to generate electricity. But this would be, by changing it to greenhouse gas reduction, you're more targeted. You're finding more targeted solutions to what the goals of the initiative would be. And I may have to defer to our Legislative Affairs Director on this part, but the Commission has drafted new legislation to enact new program design starting in 2024.
We'd be happy to answer any questions from the members, but that's.
Okay, well, I had a question from actually a senator from another committee. He did want you to put this out, and I think it's kind of, we talked a fair amount earlier about a transition away from coal-fired power plants. And so what role does the Public Service Commission have in terms of decommissioning of power plants? And in other words, is there a process in place by which, the public has input, who's responsible for any kind of cleanup, et cetera? We've got a number of coal-fired power plants that are, again, being retired over the next several years. And so that question has come up. This particular senator wanted me to put it out there. So what can you share just in terms of the role of PSC as we decommission, retire these plants? And then what, in terms of what those, that area or that property is then available for? I mean, just kind of, just big picture. Think Commissioner Linden or
Yes.
Lisa?
The role is not as extensive as we probably would hope. Typically, there would be a lot of Maryland Department of Environment, MDE, and they have more of a role in making sure that, from an environmental perspective, the plant is the results of the decommissioning are done properly. The Commission does have some role with some of the solar programs that are out now, some of the solar generating. We've actually incorporated that into our approval for CPCN. But some of the plants that we're looking at decommissioning now have been around for a while. And I suspect that the Commission probably gave them the authority to operate many, many years ago. But I doubt that there was any, and going back probably before any of us were even around, but I would suspect that there were not as many requirements for decommissioning there at that time than they are now.
And we'd be happy to follow up with the details on each one. I know, most of them were definitely probably built before I was alive, but we can certainly go back, of course, because we've been restructured to kind of do some forensics.
Okay, any information, just again, because we've had bills in here, even what do you do with the workers? Is there any retraining involved that involves the Public Service Commission, or is this purely up to the entities to do cleanup, to retrain workers? Is there something the legislature should do to provide funding? I mean, this issue is not going away, so I wanted to throw that in. Okay, we're going to go to Senator Hester, then Senator Gallion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I was curious, once again, about the transmission challenges that you mentioned. I think along the coast, once again. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. So there's, the challenge is that the offshore wind that is going to be placed offshore, we have to bring that energy on into the mainland so that it can interface and interconnect with the grid. So one of the challenges is where does that actually happen? The costs that are going to be incurred as a result of doing that. And so a lot of that is still to be developed. The commission is not going to have a lot of influence over how that happens. We certainly can interact with both PJM and with FERC to make sure that it does happen. But regarding the decision-making, we would be one of the parties that will be part of the conversation, but we're not going to be the ones to say it has to happen on this day and in this manner.
Okay, Senator Gallion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We talked a good bit, and you've brought forth about, how you're a regulatory body. As far as policymaking or affecting policy, where do you see the PSC in those regards? You look at yourself also as a body that does those two things?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The commission has a bit of a policy-making function built into it in the sense that it has to react and respond to changes in the industry. So if our utility companies, for example, you can use electric vehicles as an example. There were companies coming here installing electric vehicle charging systems. There's obviously car manufacturers that are selling electric vehicles. And so those vehicles are going to have an impact, and the charging systems are going to have an impact on the grid. And so there is built in within the idea of managing and figuring out where chargers should go, where they should be placed, how do we manage the load as a result of it. There are policy decisions that have to be made in that. And it may not be the case that, again, I use electric vehicles for this purpose. There may not have been a statute adopted prior to the change in the market or the offering of this new technology. So there are times when the commission has to develop policy within that general responsibility of regulating the industry. I personally don't think that the intent there is to usurp the authority of the General Assembly. Obviously, that's not just as a commissioner, but as a lawyer, I wouldn't think that'd be the case. And I certainly wouldn't support that. But it does, on occasion, become necessary for the commission to act.
Okay, the General Assembly is 100% definitely the primary policy maker in the state.
Absolutely.
Correct, Commissioner
Correct.
Lynn? Okay,
Absolutely.
I just want to get that
That's
right.
what I said. Just
yes,
one more.
Senator Gallion.
So back quickly to the solar issues. This was a kind of a big issue probably a couple years in my district, which is mainly Harford County. For solar siting on the bigger things, what would be considered a power generation
It's
area.
utility scale. So,
Yeah.
yes.
There was some, I guess you could say, disagreement between some of the local governments and the PSC on that. So how do you square that as far as working with the local counties to try to take their needs and desires and looking at their local zoning laws on these issues? One concern is prime and productive farmland. There's only so much of it, and when it's gone, it's gone. I know they say the solar panels aren't permanent, but 15 years or whatever seems like a long time. So how do you square the PSC desires with what local governments would like?
Thank you. So there's actually a couple of answers to that question. And I could, as an attorney, I could give you the legal answer, which is that now the Supreme Court of Maryland has made its decisions regarding the authority of the commission to cite utility scale solar through a CPCN process, and with I won't say without regard to, but with authority over the local government's ordinances or zoning that might try and prohibit us from citing it in one location versus another. The General Assembly has made clear through the passage of legislation as well that the commission should take into account concerns that the local governments have regarding the siting of utility-scale solar or any generation or transmission for that matter. The second answer is one that I would hope the local governments would accept and respect, is that I personally understand. When it comes time to not just site this new generation, be it solar, windmills, whatever, the local governments do have a new burden that's placed on them. There is a responsibility to monitor some of the conditions the commission might adopt, everything from sound impacts to trucks driving through the roads to trees that are supposed to shield everything away, the loss of the land. There's a number of challenges that the local governments now have to face and address. And so, as a commission, it's important for us to pay attention to that, the impact of how that new generation is going to impact consumers and that local government. I know personally, I'm very receptive to that. I know that my colleagues are as well. We do have a challenge sometimes because we don't always have the local governments at our proceedings. So this is where we kind of get into what I guess would be both the legal and the operational element. As a quasi-judicial agency, as we're having that proceeding to determine if the request to build out this utility-scale solar initiative should move forward or not, should it get the approvals that the commission is authorized to grant. It's imperative that we have the interaction and the involvement of the local government. Just like the General Assembly said, that we should pay attention to what they say, and it's important that they have a presence there. And we don't always have that. And I, for one, look forward to hearing from them because, as I said earlier, many of the direct on-the-ground impacts are going to be felt by that local government. And so I like to know, as we're putting forth conditions about how to move forward with this project, what those impacts are going to be. And then there's no one that can really tell us better than the people who live there and the people who govern there. I think the Commission's been very responsive for that purpose, but it isn't easy when the local governments are not able to present themselves. I do know that sometimes the local government might realize that the generation plant is there, and now they have to deal with even more coming in. And so we've heard of instances from different solar developers of challenges that they faced attempting to move forward with solar installations with regard to interacting with our local governments. I'm sorry. Oh, no. Okay. So we've had people with challenges. They've noted challenges to that, and so we've had a number of solar companies come in and request extensions when we approve their request to install solar generation, we give them a deadline. And they will return to us and say, we can't make this deadline because of permitting challenges or because of other challenges. And as a result, that solar generation is not available as part of the PJM process. It's not it might be in the queue, but it's not moving forward and on the grid. And so we've granted the requests for waivers when we receive them. And they're not always just because of local issues. I mean, certainly we've seen them because of supply chain challenges and, as I mentioned earlier, situations where companies have attempted to move forward with the project but had to deal with policy changes in the local government, et cetera. There's a lot to unpack, as you probably can tell from that, with that challenge. But I guess the short answer is that the Commission, not just by the requirement of law, but by operation as a state agency whose intended goal is to provide safe service to consumers, we should be open and available for local government concerns with regard to solar or any matters that are going to impact their service territory. And so we need to be open to hear it, but we also need them to tell us.
Okay, Senator Carozza, can I just, on this issue, this is an important issue. You know, the tension, if I just might make commentary a little bit, I recall years ago, we had wind projects in Western Maryland, and we had local ordinances, you know, promulgated saying, yes, we appreciate that the state legislature has said this, but we're not going to allow that here in this county. So if every county sort of had that position, had basically veto authority that no generation will happen in my backyard, it was like a term well, then we wouldn't have any power in the state. So that's the tension, is we need some place, there has to be generation, and in that case, I do recall, this idea that giving local commissioners somewhere essentially veto authority over public policies we're enacting here, that's potentially problematic. But with that little commentary, Senator Carozza.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and regret that I didn't hear the whole briefing, but I did have the benefit of meeting with the PSC chair, and that was very helpful. But I wanted to follow up on my colleague's question about the role of the PSC when it comes to sharing your expertise. And I guess where I'm headed with this, during last year's climate solutions debate and the whole push on all electric, and you had, different organizations and businesses coming in to basically say that, even if they could benefit from that all electric, that the grid was simply, this was too much, too fast, you weren't set up to do it. And what happens a lot in those type of debates is that the businesses takes the view, and then even when they're sharing factual information, it sometimes is dismissed because of who is presenting it. So I didn't know, and this is, I'm new to this energy issue and what the interaction is, but in a case like an issue like that, does the PSC kind of take a look at this and say, maybe what's being proposed is just not ready at this point, that this is going to take more time, maybe you shared that, but it just, it just seems that that type of information could be helpful.
Thank you for that, Senator Carozza, and I'm sorry I missed the meeting last week. I was out sick. But yes, we've also extended meetings as well to the offices of every member here, so we'll get a chance to meet with everyone. It's a great question. We were behind the scenes definitely analyzing every single version of that bill, every amendment, answering questions. We're always here. We're going to follow your lead. As Chair Feldman said, General Assembly, definitely the policymaker, we're the implementing agency. And we see ourselves, we're usually looking through a lens as we're reviewing even all the bills coming out now. We're looking for, can we do this, right? Is it feasible? What's the budget? What's the fiscal impact? Do we have capacity? Does it, is it internally consistent? Does it even make sense, right? But we're trying to follow your lead if you're the policymakers and you want to go this way. For example, on renewable energy, we usually don't weigh in on, we think this should come in or we think this should come out. We look at that as sort of a policy decision, and we do get, we get some negative feedback sometimes if legislators think we're weighing in a little too much on policy. So that being said, we will weigh in. We did put in, I believe, written testimony. Always, if you want to hear from us, at the table, obviously, we'll always listen to the chair, to the members, what would be helpful. We're here, we can bring in experts, we can take
Right,
time.
and I understand, and
Yep.
I understand clearly the policy role. I think where, to me, the information from you, and whether it's your PSC or other departments or agencies, that, you're the subject matter experts. You, I believe, would have an obligation to at least, put the facts out as you know it. And meaning that that is information that then should be factored in by the policy makers. But, in a process like that, again, and I don't know what happened the back and forth last year, but, you know, as different amendments and proposals are being floated, you know, was it a case where we need to request that information from you, or you were sharing that information with us?
Understood. We typically, you'll see a lot of written testimony from us with our analyses, that we do have an internal process. It's all going through our technical staff. Often numerous divisions within technical staff are weighing in, and we're combining, you know, the economists and the accountants, and we have a whole process for that that Kathy helps me oversee. We usually have about 80 bills at least that we're weighing in on. So I think you'll definitely see testimony from us. We weighed in on CSNA. I think Climate Solutions Now Act in this committee, yes, the work of this committee, we tried to weigh in. I know, especially with the floor amendments, when it came down to the compromise with the electrification study, that we were going to have to implement that. We were like really, I think we had like 8 hours to recraft the whole thing and make it kind of doable in terms of, we weren't looking at, you know, it was more so, okay, legislature, what would you like to see? We want to get you what you need to make these decisions. So if you need a study, you need information, we want to get that to you so you can make informed policy decisions. But we were kind of looking at making it workable, so who has this data, right? What do the utilities have? What do we might need from the Department of Labor? So that's what we're kind of looking at it from a workability standpoint, but we'll continue, we'll take, you know, your words to heart, and hopefully everyone else agrees, and we'll, you know, try to weigh in as much as we can.
Okay, any final questions before we bring closure to our briefing for today? Okay, seeing that, thank you, Commissioner Litton and Lisa. And so we're going to take a break for what, 5 minutes? Okay, so that's done with our briefing. We only have two bills. And so why don't we take between a 5 and 10 minute break, and let's come back here and knock out those two bill hearings, and we'll be done for the day, okay? Maybe 5 minutes or a few more minutes, okay?